What's up, everybody? It's Matt here again, coming at you with another discussion slash just review of a short story I read recently. So, if you're new here, my name's Matt, and on this channel, what I do is I do a lot of discussions and kind of commentaries and reviews on the books I'm reading and kind of how those relate to modern life, particularly through the lens for young men or men in their early adulthood. So, yeah, without any further ado, we can go ahead and get into it. So, the story I read yesterday, I keep trying to not say book. The short story I read yesterday was actually called The Diary of a Madman by Leo Tolstoy. So, this story was written, like many of his short stories, towards the end of his life. So, most of the short stories that Tolstoy wrote were actually after he wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And full disclosure, I have not read those books yet. I have read a metric ton of Dostoevsky books, but I have yet to read Tolstoy. So this is my first foray into Tolstoy's work. So I'm not going to sit here and claim to be the authority on his life and whatnot. All I know is kind of the documentary type evidence that I've gotten from other sources. So Leo Tolstoy is very different from Dostoevsky. So the way I think of it is, whereas Dostoevsky was kind of grew up in like the imperial system. I mean, they all did in that time. Tolstoy, towards the end of his life, whereas Dostoevsky kind of reverted very strongly back to Orthodox Christianity, and viewing that as like the anchor on which Russian culture was moored. I think Tolstoy kind of developed his own sort of spiritual Christianity that wasn't so much grounded in the practices and teachings of the church. So look at that in today's language, like the guy who starts just going back to the church that he grew up in when he's in his 50s to the guy that moves to the desert in Nevada and kind of develops his own flavor of spiritualized Christianity. That's kind of how I look at it. Again, layman's view here. So the setting for this book is actually one diary entry by this madman, and it was set in 1883. So the translation I read actually was the Paviar and Velikonski translation that came in this collection of his short stories, which I'm still working through. I know I've said some things about the Paviar and Velikonski translations before, and to be honest with you, I don't find it to be an issue here. Some stories by some Russian authors that are very convoluted and have lots of twists and turns, and mainly when it comes from the perspective that the speakers and the narrators are speaking from, that's where it can get a little bit confusing. But most of these are very much first person with a little bit of third person, omniscient, narrator interjecting. So anyway, all that goes to say that this collection of short stories is really good. And to be honest with you, I really love the cover of this one. Some book covers are kind of bleh, like a lot of the Paviar and Velikonski translations by Vintage. They're these like kind of abstract, semi-related covers to what's in the book, versus the Oxford World Classics have a variety of translators, but they also usually feature like a work of art on the cover, like the Demons book that I reviewed, and Anna Karenina, which is probably the translation that I'm going to read, is the Oxford one, because I've heard really great things about the translator for the Oxford translation of Anna Karenina. Anyway, side note, but let's get into the story a little bit. So this madman begins with a very brief excerpt from his childhood. And what this, maybe 10 page or so short story, it kind of involves the juxtaposition of worldly success versus spiritual fulfillment. And so as a young man up until he was 15, he was kind of an innocent child. He didn't really have the madness descend upon him. But what the madness was just like a almost bottomless feeling of, hopelessness or impending doom or meaninglessness. And it wasn't necessarily madness when he was a child. He just said that he had several, instances where he just was wondering about the stories from the Bible that his like nannies would read to him. But then 20 years go by from age 15 to 35. He just kind of lives amongst vice and in the world. So that probably includes things like women and gambling and drinking and traditional Russian vices of those 1800s. Dostoevsky was also very familiar with them if you've read any of his books, The Gambler being a noteworthy one. Anyway, so around 35, he's, gone to law school. He's a lawyer. He's actually what's the word? He's doing various legal functions at this time. I think being a notary is the one that's mentioned in the short story. And, in traditional fashion, he's ready to take the next step. So he's obviously got a pretty comfy position in the civil service. He's got a law degree. He's successful by every metric that was important at that time. He had a good salary. He had a good position. He had a relatively clear path to higher positions with higher salaries. So the logical next step is to purchase a property. And in those days, you wanted to have a property that, one, had a fair amount of serfs kind of on it, because in provincial Russia, the property owner would, have, multiple families of serfs that had their own homes and gardens on the land, and they would work the land for the property owner. But by this time, in the 1880s, the serfs were emancipated. So what that looked like was kind of like people that didn't have the economic means to, move out on their own. They kind of still were glued to that land that maybe their parents or grandparents had lived on as serfs. So either way, when you're buying the land, you're getting people with it still, even though they may not be legally serfs with no rights. You get these people that come with it, and you also get timber. So, being a frugal man, he wanted to make sure that the land had adequate timber to cover the cost of purchase and serfs. So he's going with his servant, who, he's boys with. They laugh and they have fun and kind of, make good-spirited small talk as they go out there. But then as night falls, as he's approaching this property he's going to inspect, to buy, this sense of doom just comes over him, and he just cannot put a pin on what it is. And he starts to ask himself questions like, what is the purpose of this? Why am I feeling this way? Like, why am I even going out here? Like, what is the purpose of buying this property? And he pretty much calls the carriage driver to stop in the next town that they approach. And he goes into the room. Everyone goes to sleep. The servant goes to sleep. The poor dude at the front desk of this boarding house goes to sleep. And he sits in this room, and he just cannot sleep. He just has the feeling of doom is just so overwhelming. He does everything he can to not just have a panic attack. And for the first time in 20 years, he starts, starts crossing himself and saying the Lord have mercy prayer and all these prayers that he hasn't said again in decades. And eventually he just wakes everybody up. He's like, all right, let's just keep going. And interestingly enough, Tolstoy says that it was the act of moving that made it go away. So right then and there, he hints at something really profound that I think a lot of us in today's world experience firsthand. It's that need to keep running on the treadmill to avoid that feeling of doom overtaking us. It's as long as you're moving forward, be it in your career, in the things that interest you, in your hobbies, as long as you're chasing something, the thing that chases you, i.e. the knowledge of your own mortality and what that means, it can't catch you because you're too occupied with other things. And so he kind of he lets the next few years pass. He ends up not buying the property. He goes home, and he kind of starts going to church again because he's like, well, that was strange. I don't know why I felt that, but I'm going to just kind of, just as an insurance policy, do a little bit more than the once yearly communion. So another couple months and years go by, and he has to go to Moscow for a trial. And he's in the legal service in some capacity, so he has to go to Moscow. Goes there, meets another happy-go-lucky guy, just kind of making small talk, and then he gets to the hotel room, and it hits him again, the anxiety, more particularly the spiritual death anxiety. And he goes to opera, and he goes to dinner after with this guy that he met on the way. They just decided to, be buddies for the duration of his trip. And he puts off going back to that room for as long as he possibly can. But he comes back, and the feeling comes back. And anyway, this cycle repeats itself one final time when he's hunting with his friends out in the snow. But after this Moscow incident, he started getting even more spiritual. He started saying prayers daily. And he says, even though he didn't know what they were doing or even fully believe in them, he just said them because it, in some small, tiny way, made him feel better. He never ended up buying the property. He never ended up, taking that step to become he never takes the necessary steps to enter that final upper echelon of Russian society that's just below general and buddies with the czar, but just above just still civil servant. It's that bracket of society that many people, that was the highest that 90% of the population could ever aspire to. He voluntarily essentially decides not to enter that strata of society because a lot of his emptiness bouts come on when he's kind of tangentially touching on that, that cusp of society. And so he's out hunting, and he goes over a ridge to, chase what he believes is a wolf that tripped one of his traps. And he gets lost in the snow, and he just starts praying. But then he realizes that, yes, it's a very spiritual realization, a very Tolstoyan, from what I've come to understand that to mean, that, he's screwed up. He is a hopeless screw up, but it's okay. It's just it's a very humble, no matter how good I think I am, I won't be good enough. And that's kind of what he comes to realize. And then he, and the epilogue, if you'd call it that, of a short story that's 10 pages. He's at a church service and walks out and sees the beggars, and he just kind of gives away all the rubles that he had on his person to them. And kind of the way the story ends is that this guy just decided to live for other people as opposed to live for himself, as opposed to seeking to exploit others for his own gain and for his own social status. He just starts to, what's implied is that he gets very much into the spiritual aspects of church, not so much as a polemic by Tolstoy on the need to become, Christian, but more so as a need to find something spiritual to ground yourself in a society that values itself, in which the people in that society appraise themselves on the basis of their material status, on their social status, on what they can point to and say, look, this is my property. Look, I made 10,000 rubles in timber last year. This is Tolstoy's way of saying, all of that's just noise. Because in those moments, in those quiet moments, like in the hotel in Moscow or in that boarding house in the country on the way, it's in those moments that no matter what you have amassed materially, there will still be a void that says to you, you're going to die and all this is going to be for nothing. So what are you living for? And I think that's the really powerful message that this very short story can impart to you. So yeah, a lot of food for thought in our society where, a lot of people in the corporate world appraise themselves by their LinkedIn history. God, that makes me want to freaking throw up. But it's true, a lot of people look at people's Instagrams and look at where someone has traveled to. They look at, I think people put on a lot of facades these days. And, whereas back then it was a completely non-digital society, it was very, who you saw at the ball or who you saw at your dachas in the summer and where your dacha was, was it in this part of the town outside of Petersburg, or was it in middle of nowhere, Ukraine, even back then there was elements of this, but I think it's gotten hyper, it's metastasized to an unreasonable degree these days, to where even the people that are living, ramen noodle paycheck to paycheck will still try and, portray themselves on social media. And it's just an unhealthy way of appraising yourself, and that's an unhealthy way of living in this world. And I think that sometimes, we can hear all these spiritual gurus who put these YouTube videos out nowadays, and they make tens of thousands of dollars based on the products and courses and BS they sell. It's way more interesting, in my opinion, to hear the opinion of someone from 100 years ago in a non-digital society who, for all intents and purposes, refused to take financial compensation for the stuff he did. He really looked at his writing and his art as just his attempts at wrestling with the human condition. So yeah, that's just a quick little discussion, review, with spoilers, honestly, of a short story by Tolstoy. I really enjoyed it, and I think that his writing style is really not too different from Dostoevsky, so I'll probably keep reading more for sure. Yeah, appreciate all your time today. Let me know in the comments if you've read this short story or what other short stories of Tolstoy that you found enjoyable. Yeah, let me know. Hope you all have a good one, and have a great week. See ya.